Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, I'm joined by John Gasaway, who covers college basketball for ESPN, one of our favorite recurring guests here on Podcast on the Brink. And it's just me and John. Alex was unable to join us for this discussion. But I wanted to have John on because we talked with him early in the season before the Indiana-Illinois game. And so much has changed for these two teams since that game. John, of course, an Illinois fan, in addition to the coverage that he provides generally on college basketball. And so I wanted to get his thoughts on the changes, what's happened to Indiana, what has turned around for Illinois as we lead into this game, to give us some context for that game, and also to talk to John about some of the other topics that he's been writing about recently. Most notable, of course, his Bubble Watch columns on ESPN, where he's talked about Indiana, but also talked about kind of a looming threat for teams like Indiana on the bubble that we're going to talk about. And then I want to dig in a little bit more on the shot volume index that John has written about, because this really became clear, just the impact of this in the Indiana-Michigan State game. It's essentially the reason why Indiana was able to win that game, despite Michigan State shooting so much better from the field. So we'll talk about what that is, dig into it a little bit more, all in this kind of wide-ranging conversation on Podcast on the Brink. Before we get to that, a quick word from our sponsor, this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, brought to you by our friends at Home Field. And at homefieldapparel.com, you will find the comfiest and most unique licensed IU apparel that is available anywhere. Home Field was started by an IU grad, and all Home Field apparel is designed and printed out of Indianapolis. And now that it's March, Home Field has you covered for tournament season. You can find your favorite vintage IU basketball apparel from Home Field, and you can wear it proudly as IU survives and advances. And essentially, we are in survive and advance mode now for Indiana. I mean, it kind of feels like every game is an elimination game, at least for the NCAA tournament purposes. The Hoosiers need to beat Illinois. They need to beat Rutgers. Obviously, if they advance all the way in the Big Ten tournament, they'll make the NCAA tournament, but probably need to win a game or two there as well. So every game important, and of course, we hope that at the end of it, there is tournament play for the Hoosiers. Our biggest hope is the NCAA tournament, but a minimum the NIT, and you can go to Home Field and you can get the gear that you can wear for all of those games. And definitely think about that tri-blend fleece hoodie with the Bison logo. When I was in Bloomington, I saw so many people wearing it, and it was really cool to see because that's a great item. So definitely check that out. And when you're there, don't forget to use the promo code BRINK at checkout for 15% off your first order. That's at homefieldapparel.com, promo code BRINK. Home Field, wear one for the team. And now, here's my conversation with John Gasaway. All right, and I'm joined by John Gasaway, one of our favorite recurring guests. John, thanks, as always, for taking the time to join us here on Podcast on the Brink.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, the last time we talked, it was before the Indiana-Illinois game earlier this season. And that game went about how we thought. Indiana beat Illinois. The Hoosiers go to 3-0 in the conference. I think it put Illinois at 0-3 or 0-4 at the time. I don't think anybody could have predicted what would happen to the two teams since then. How do you explain Indiana's precipitous slide since that game, and Illinois really turning things around, and I think being 7-8 in conference play, and now being above the Hoosiers in the conference standings since that game?
First of all, I'm flattered and a little stunned that you would have me back, given that history. It does mean that now Indiana will win its next game, however, lose the next, 40. So that seems like a bad trade, but if you're willing to hazard that.
We are very focused on just the next game. So as long as we can win the next game, we're not worried about what happens after. Right now.
I came on. Indiana did win the next game, so there you go. This is, I guess, I'm your good luck charm here. It's been a really wild ride. This is why I loved college basketball as a fan for years before I ever got into the business, quote unquote. You can't know things like this are going to, in fact, the whole tenor of that conversation was, you guys asking me about Illinois, and I was like, oh man, why are we going to talk about Illinois? don't humor me, with these, token Illini questions. And yeah, as you say, I mean, who knew that these paths would go the way that they would? For listeners who don't know, I went to Illinois. I'm wearing my block eye cap temporarily for this part of the conversation only. I am encouraged for next year. I hope Dosunmu sticks around. That's a huge question. He seems right in the sweet spot for the kind of player where you would go, oh no, he's taking a flyer and leaving early. He should never do that. And then, one way or another, it actually does work out okay for him. But we'll see what happens there. I'm much more optimistic for the future than I was when we did this call the first time. And then as far as Indiana, hey, they're still in there battling. It could, a season sweep of Michigan State. I'll take that for my team. And I'm sure we'll talk in some detail about what the chances actually look like. But, given a team that has lost as many games since we first talked, as Indiana has, it's pretty remarkable that we're going to be having a conversation about, so can they make the tournament? So full credit to the Never Die Hoosiers there. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, the odd question is, I think we'd all take a season sweep of Michigan State. The question is, would you then trade losing almost every other game around it? Which is what's been so odd about it.
I think some deal was made with somebody. I don't know if they had pointy horns and a pitchfork or what, but they did get the season sweep of Michigan State and came at a heavy cost.
We've obviously spent many, many weeks, dissecting every reason for Indiana's slide. Why, and it's obviously nuanced when you're losing like this, and there are obviously many different reasons why it happens. From your perspective, a little bit further removed from it, maybe even more analytically, what has happened to Indiana that has caused, and obviously they've lost the last two, but overall to lose 12 out of 15?
Right. I mean, I was in there in the middle of the, losing streak when it was at its peak, documenting game by game what at that time was Indiana's historically inept and specifically low volume 3-point shooting. And that was certainly not helping matters at the time. And indeed, if you look at this is the blinding flash of the obvious for IU fan listeners, but it's still, if you look at the whole season numbers, if I could just pull the curtain back on them to you in the preseason, or even, I don't know, after the first two Big Ten December games when all looked well, you'd be really surprised at what this offense looks like statistically with, everything that we spoke of in the first call, and a guy who's about to be a lottery pick, and Juwan Morgan, and all of the good things that you would think would be attached to that. But this is still, the worst offense in the Big Ten in conference play, not named Northwestern. And this is still the worst 3-point shooting team. So, sometimes the role of advanced analytics is just to get out of the way and point. And I kind of feel like the Indiana offense is one of these times. You don't see something like that in every game. It doesn't go to form, in any individual 40 minutes, but writ large over 18 and eventually 20 Big Ten games. I mean, that has been the story.
Yeah, one of the things I want to talk to you about, maybe we can just talk about it right here, is some of the work that you've done with shot volume index, and, how one of the ways, for an offense that may not be a great percentage shooting team, which Indiana obviously has been one of the worst 3-point shooting teams in Big Ten history, one of the things that you can do then is just get more shots up. Even if you're shooting a low percentage, if you just get more shots up, that can really help you. And, a couple of stats that you can look at that help you do that are reducing your turnover percentage, so you have more opportunities to shoot, and grabbing more offensive rebounds, so you have more opportunities to shoot. And it's been interesting to kind of look at the trends, because it has felt like, as Indiana has played better, since that first Michigan State game, that's one of the things that they've been doing, where their turnover rate and their offensive rebounding percentage, which both were basically almost perfectly average, or, for the season are almost perfectly average, they've been better than those averages in most games over the last few weeks. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's coincided with them playing better, winning a few games, and certainly playing a lot of other ones close. And it really hit me in the Michigan State game where, a lot of people talked after the game, how on earth does Michigan State lose a game where they shoot 60% on twos and 40% from three-point range, and Indiana, is down, shooting 37% from both? It's like, well, we just got 13 more shots than they did because we pounded the offensive glass and only turned it over 8 times. So that, for a team like Indiana, that kind of seems like the path that you need to take to compensate for your poor shooting is, let's reduce turnovers, get some offensive rebounds, and just see how many shots we can get up. And that's obviously independent of free throw shooting, but maybe you can speak a little bit to that, the importance of shot volume, because I think it's not something that you often hear talked about, but it's so important.
Right. You hit the nail on the head in terms of Indiana, and it's a great point that when you've got, as you said, one of the lowest, 3-point accuracy figures in a long time, you can lose sight of why we still are talking about this team in terms of NCAA tournament hopes. And it's not that Indiana's shot volume is sterling by any means, but compared to the shooting, and it's with the 3-point shooting being the way it is, then shooting from the field period is also very bad, about as bad as Nebraska's and worse than anybody's, than, again, Northwestern. But as you say, the shot volume for the season is average, and in the recent past, it's better than that. And that's kind of interesting specific to Miller, because he has flirted with the low offensive rebound lifestyle, shall we call it, in the past. And it's usually when he's, or certainly at Dayton, it was when he was concerned about his depth. And I interviewed him one time about it, and he just came out and said, I can't ask these guys, he's got like a 6 or 7 man rotation at the time. I can't ask these guys to do all this and offensive rebound too, which is understandable and normal, but it does hit your bottom line in terms of how many shots you get. Another dog that hasn't barked, something that we've talked about on these calls in past years, is you pulling your hair about a high turnover rate. Well, that's not there. The turnovers are fine. So when you match, average turnovers with a perfectly normal offensive rebound rate, you get a pretty nice shot volume, particularly in the context of the Big Ten, where teams are wildly different in how they approach that style, shall we say. I mean, Purdue is just a monster of shot volume. It to me, it explains why they're good. Their defense is okay. Their shooting is pretty good, but one thing that's even better than the shooting is their shot volume. But at the other end of the spectrum in the Big Ten, you've got teams that really don't buy it and don't try. So when Indiana is perfectly normal and average in terms of the conference mean, that can actually be an affirmative value against some teams and in conference play in general. So I'm right there with you. I'm on board with it, and it's an underrated aspect of why they've been able to survive the horrendous shooting as relatively well as they can, even though there have obviously been a lot of losses.
One other way that you can do that too is with free throw shooting, getting to the line. And Indiana's done a pretty good job in terms of free throw volume. The percentage obviously hasn't been very good. That's not something that's taken into account in shot volume. How do you kind of compensate for that, I suppose? Because obviously, I mean, free throw shooting and having an advantage in how many times you get to the line can be a really important way that you can compensate and get some extra points.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes up within the context of individual games, just in terms of something that I feel can be relied on looking forward. The thing about offensive free throw rate is obviously it's reliant to some extent on the officials. Sure, you see teams that are better at getting to the line than others, but where free throw rate really kicks in as far as I don't want to say consistent, but more or less seamless metric that can extend across future games is more on the defensive side. Obviously, Michigan this year, to take one example, has been fantastic at not fouling, and that's pretty much par for the course with John Beilein. Indiana, pretty good on that as well. But again, with offensive free throw rate, you are unavoidably in part dependent on the officials, and of course in part dependent on the style of the defense you're playing. But exactly as you say, the Hoosiers are getting to the line with above average frequency in Big Ten play, and that's been a help, even though they haven't necessarily led the league in accuracy once they get there.
Which is a good segue to talking about this Indiana-Illinois game, because I mean that's one of the biggest differences between the two teams is that defensive free throw rate, where Indiana doesn't put teams on the line very much, and Illinois puts teams on the line all the time.
From time to time.
Yeah, I mean it's part of their defense, and I think all Indiana fans remember the game last year in Illinois where the Hoosiers got to the line 29 times, only made 16 of them. And Illinois, shoots 72% on their 32 attempts. I mean, they got to the line a lot, and that, clearly decided the game. So as you look to kind of keys to this game, obviously the free throw line will play an important role. What else will you kind of look at as probably being the determining factors in this game on Thursday night?
Yeah, the weird, easy to overlook big story here is that this is a situation where you've got a team that has swept Michigan State and is coming into, Champaign battling for its NCAA tournament life against a forlorn, woebegone, has-been that's got no shot at the tournament. And it's the home team that, if you're looking at Big Ten play, at least, they're the statistical favorite. I mean, it's not even close, in per possession terms. Illinois' efficiency margin is about well, I mean, they're both underwater, so you'd say Illinois is half as bad as Indiana. Yeah. So it's a weird dynamic, and Illinois has, been known to be pretty good at home. So I think that's before we delve into the nuts and bolts of analytics or players, I mean, I think that's the weird part of this that I don't really remember happening, and it's part and parcel of Indiana's unique situation, which I'm not sure offhand I can compare to any other team that I can think of. This, on paper, is a tough game for IU, and it feels weird to say that about an Illinois team that, goodness knows, and I've been right there for every minute of it, has had its struggles the last two seasons. But I mean, that is the way it shapes up, and it's a case where I'm sure Miller is not having any trouble stressing and emphasizing that, and they'll have to be taking this seriously. The thing that you wouldn't want from an Indiana perspective is that weird, I don't want to say listlessness, but that weird performance of Minnesota, for lack of a better term, where
it's a very charitable way of describing it.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything about that we're saying about this game really applied to that game too, in terms of how important it was.
Yeah.
And we'll know very soon if, what the dynamics are, but it's got the potential to be a great game because, it matters to both teams. And I hope that's what we get.
For Indiana fans who watch that first game, what will be the biggest differences about Illinois that they will notice?
Illinois just is way more confident and way less incompetent, if I can be frank, on offense. They've got some moving parts that work now with Dosunmu and Georgie, and it's nothing it's nothing revelatory or particularly complex in terms of X's and O's, but Dosunmu has. Well, he was good all along, but he's come into his own more so, and he's got some help. Illinois statistically is decent as far as shooting the ball. That doesn't really come to the fore because opponents are fantastic at shooting the ball. But they're average at making their twos and making their threes, and they get an occasional offensive board, so they're okay too, like Indiana on shot volume. And that reflects, those are whole season numbers you're talking about there, but that really reflects more recent success. And I don't want to say a team gelling because the record is still what it is, but a shared level of comfort and as hoary as the cliche is, a buy-in to the system. So there's no doubt about it. They have been looking better lately.
When I was kind of looking at matchups for this game, and I don't want to butcher his last name, so I won't try. I'll just call him Georgie, like you did. He really had a nice game against Indiana the first time. He was 8 of 9. He had 18 points. If I recall correctly, he just, when Illinois got off to their early lead, they were up 23-13 early in that game. He was a big part of it. And Indiana did not have Deron Davis, or I think Deron Davis may have played 3 minutes, and that's where he re-injured or injured his ankle. They didn't have Race Thompson. If you look at, Illinois' last 7 or 8 games, when they were really rolling again, when they beat Michigan State, they beat Rutgers, they beat Ohio State, he was just dominating. I think he averaged like 23 points over those games, was playing 32 minutes, making like 70% of his twos. Over the last 4 games, it has seemed like he's been in foul trouble more. His efficiency has been down. I think he's only scoring maybe 13 or 14 points. And, it would seem like Indiana would be better suited to defending him now with Deron, which should help Juwan not pick up fouls. Then obviously Race Thompson, who did a nice job on Ethan Happ. Don't know what this game will be like offensively for Race, but at least defensively, it seems like he could do a job there. How important do you think that battle will be in determining the outcome?
If Illinois is not hitting threes, then it's of central importance. And you're right, Georgie's been in a foul-infused funk. I mean, he had some okay games when he was in foul. He was in foul trouble in the win against Michigan State. So I don't want to paint it as direct cause and effect, but he absolutely, for whatever reason, has been in a slump, and Illinois has not. Illinois hasn't beaten any team, not named Northwestern since that has happened. So. The reason that an Illinois fan can be encouraged one reason is that Georgie is a 6'9" freshman who's showing some good skills, who's got nice whole season numbers, but those have gone south in the last few games, and he was fantastic right around the era, not just with Michigan State, but Rutgers, which I can understand is a game not many people saw. Ohio State, he was really good, and low those 2.5 to 3 weeks ago now. If he could snap back, if he could return, you're absolutely right. That would put a lot more pressure on an IU defense, and we'll see if he is able to do that.
Both Illinois and Indiana are coming off games they won that included true outlier performances from certain individuals. Andres Feliz comes off the bench and shoots 17 free throws en route to 26 points against Northwestern. Justin Smith, of course, scores 13 of Indiana's first 14 points and finishes with 24 against Michigan State. Which of those two guys is more likely, do you think, to repeat his impressive performent?
I am so here for a mano battle between those two, and maybe Feliz is the new Melo Trimble. We'll look. He's just going to drive into the paint, do the "I've been fouled" head snap, and give me free throws, and it's an effective thing. No, I don't suppose actually either of those performances, especially the 17 free throws part from Feliz. But this is the way that games play out, and players that you don't expect to have those performances can. And Justin Smith, I'm not making light of what was a fantastic performance that was legit. I mean, he was scoring from both sides of the arc, and
don't tell Tom Izzo that.
Okay. Yeah, he took that loss in stride.
Yeah.
So, I'm not saying Smith can't have an impact, and maybe that is the beginning of an emergence. But these are the kinds of dynamics that do come to play. I mean, it's March, and we're talking about players emerging. So we'll see which ones come to the fore in Champaign in this next game.
Let's talk a little bit about the NCAA tournament. You obviously write a great Bubble Watch column at ESPN. And I think all Indiana fans understand the obvious risks to the Hoosiers making the NCAA tournament. You can't take many more losses, if any. Certainly in the regular season, they need to win these games, maybe one or two in the Big Ten tournament. So we all understand the work that needs to be done there. But you wrote about something recently that is important to remember as you start projecting forward, especially for bubble teams, which is the potential for bid thieves. And you wrote, history suggests these conditions are extremely friendly to bid thieves. Why is this season in particular friendly to bid thieves, and which conference tournaments, which teams should fans of programs like Indiana be particularly keeping their eye on?
The unique parts of this season that we didn't see last year and that you don't see most years that make me look at mock brackets and think, man, I don't know, because all mock brackets start from the assumption of zero bid thieves. The weird parts of 2019 are as follows. One, an extremely weak Pac-12. And I know people like to make fun of the weakest major conference every year. For the last 2 years, that's been the Pac-12. Back before that, it was often the SEC. I get it. It's a beloved genre. But the thing about the Pac-12 this year in particular is you are seriously talking about right now maybe 1.5 at-large bid quality teams. Definitely Washington. Arizona State on a knife edge. That could go either way. That's it. And you don't usually see that. The last time we've seen that level of at-large scarcity from a major conference in the last 10 years, it's only happened twice. And it was back then, it was called the Pac-10 in 2010 and also the Pac-12 in 2012. And at both of those conference tournaments, there were bid thieves. So I would not be surprised to see that happen with the Pac-12 tournament in 2019. Obviously, Washington's legit. They are the best team in the conference. But you've got 9 teams in the Pac-12 that are all clustered right in between about number 65 and number 110 on whatever your power ranking of choice is, whether it's net or KenPom or whatever you prefer. That's a good situation in which to bet on the rest of the field, because Washington is just one team and there's 9 other teams that are clumped about, 20 to 40 spots below them. That's, in probability terms, it's probably going to be somebody. Washington is the most likely team to win, but it's more likely that a non-Washington team will win. So high bid thief potential in the Pac-12. Even though we haven't seen it from a major conference in recent years. And then, the real headline that we should be pointing at, because it's so strange, is everyone agrees that Buffalo out of the MAC and Wofford out of the SoCon are on solid ground in terms of an at-large. And that has huge implications for the bubble, because that means the MAC and SoCon tournaments matter. And that has not been the case now for 19 years. We're just, every mock bracket shows 2 bids and 2 bids only going to the MAC and the SoCon, Buffalo and Wofford. All that has to happen is one of those teams has to lose their conference or fail to win their conference tournament. And you're talking about 3 bids if we're right that they're both on solid ground, and I think we are. They could both lose, then you'd be talking about 4 bids. So, these have major implications for the size of the bubble. The Atlantic 10, again, was just made for a bid thief, because we've got, just like we did last year with Rhode Island, we've got one solid at-large and only one in VCU. And again, the likelihood is that a team besides VCU will win the tournament, even though VCU is the most likely team to win. all of these things added together mean, you could see in theory an entire, this would be extreme, but in theory, you could see an entire last four in list wiped out. I think it more likely to be that it will shrink by 2 or 3 spots, but still 2 or 3 is a lot. And it's going to be awfully fun to watch over the next few days here until Selection Sunday.
Awfully fun and nerve-wracking. Lots of other teams to pay attention to for fans of Indiana and other bubble teams. How do you view Indiana's resume? I mean, I think you obviously think the Hoosiers have a chance, and I think you probably agree. I would assume that they need to win these next 2 games. But how do you view Indiana's resume specifically? And then I'd love to get just kind of your thoughts generally on a team like Indiana where the volume of wins isn't there, but the quality is so high and, and the schedule strength is so great. How much should that be weighted over a team, that maybe has 20-some wins but hasn't faced the kind of competition that Indiana has?
Right. I mean, I think that Indiana can get into the NCAA tournament. That's why they've got a blurb at Bubble Watch, and that starts with winning these next 2 games at Illinois and at home against Rutgers. I feel like the probability of winning those 2 games is somewhat underestimated out in the world at large. I mean, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be the biggest story of the 2019 season if they win those 2 games, but still, it's not a done deal. So it starts there, and then it entails not only a good showing at the Big Ten tournament, but specifically, a good team being thrown in Indiana's path that they can then beat. So these are the things that have to happen. The assumption I guess I make with Indiana, whose profile is so strange, but definitely at the bottom line worthy of consideration, is I guess I feel like great things like sweeping Michigan State and beating Louisville and beating Marquette. Those need to be understood as those are baked in. That's the reason we're talking about Indiana. We've got that, and it's not a situation where a committee member is going to slap their forehead now in March and say, wow, they swept Michigan State. That's understood. Yeah. The season starts now. I mean, that's the reason Indiana is in this conversation. And it's, that argument has been made and accepted. I've got no private pipeline into the committee, but I would be shocked if, that doesn't get Indiana a hearing. Now, what is Indiana going to do? And, maybe I'm naive, but I feel like it's almost kind of cut and dried. I mean, there's a lot of easy scenarios to concoct where you say, okay, that's not going to get it done. I kind of feel like, losing either of the next 2 games, for instance, would absolutely necessitate getting all the way to the Big Ten conference championship game, that kind of thing. And, the resume is what it is. It's high on losses and high on great wins, both. And now what can Indiana do, understanding all the while that they're competing against a lot of teams that are doing the exact same thing. I mean, I think the numbers at Bubble Watch right now are something like 31 teams for 16 spots. So it's a tough needle to thread. But Indiana has a shot, which is something I would not have said a week ago.
Last question for you, John. As we look ahead to the Big Ten tournament, who do you look at as kind of the favorite in the Big Ten tournament, and what is a team or two from the bottom half of the conference that if I told you there's going to be a team from the bottom half in the championship game on Sunday that you would feel most likely predicting it will be?
Well, first of all, Michigan always wins. Let's get this out of the way. It'll be like a last-second shot, or they've got some kind of Big Ten tournament voodoo. No, I actually did pick Michigan. There was a grid at ESPN.com for all 32 conference tournaments, and all of us writers making our picks. And I picked Michigan because I do think Beeline's got a good shtick going for. Obviously, for a postseason tournament. He also has been to a national championship game or 2. Yeah. But, by the way, Michigan's a really good team and has been for the whole season, and that helps too. And They play good defense, which is something that can carry you through consecutive days. And their offense has shown flashes of real improvement and looking very good. So all that made me pull the trigger on Michigan. We'll see how that works. This is all, we haven't seen a bracket. This is all completely seat of our pants talking here. You could conceive a brutal path for somebody, given the lay of the land in the Big Ten this year, where you've got some legit teams at the top, and it's just a matter of where the tiebreakers fall. But we'll fling Michigan out there bracket blind. And as far as a team from the bottom, I guess I would have to know how we define the bottom. But I'll take a long look at Minnesota for that role. They've been underwhelming for a lot of the year, but for people who don't necessarily follow very, very middle of the pack Minnesota team from game to game, Amir Coffey might be like the best player in the Big Ten right now? ? He's blowing up. He's scoring 30 points every time he goes on the floor. And when you put that alongside of, same old, I get every rebound in the game, Jordan Murphy, and a guy like Oturu who seems like he could just go nuts, at any game you don't know when. That makes them an interesting candidate for the role you describe, where nobody talks about them. They're middle of the pack, but they could do something. So I'll highlight the Gophers for that one.
Yeah, well, and they're coming off a huge win over Purdue, so they're obviously playing some good basketball here late in the season.
Yep, that's one. I'm riding that bandwagon.
All right. Well, John, thank you as always for joining us on Podcast on the Brink. Follow him at John Gasaway on Twitter. Read his columns on ESPN, and we look forward to seeing much more of your insight and hopefully Indiana continuing to be a prominent name in your Bubble Watch columns here moving forward.
Yeah, just keep bringing that suspenseful entertainment, Indiana. It's good stuff.
Good stuff is one way to put it. Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.